Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Debate in Lund. You know what I like about these events is that they always feel special somehow, and it's somehow even more special tonight. We have a special occasion. The special occasion is, of course, the Science Week. So the University of Lund is celebrating 350 years this year. And we're doing that tonight, celebrating it through having a discussion over the very simple question, of course, will digital destroy or develop democracy? That should be easy to figure out, I think. Maybe not so much, but we're going to give it a shot. All through the week, the university is discussing the issues of digital in all sorts of ways, starting today, going all through the week in all kinds of interesting seminars, and we've already heard some amazing presentations today. My name is Andreas Ekström. I can usually be found in the newsroom at regional morning paper Sydsvenskan, but sometimes they do let me out to host things like this, which of course is the university that is formally hosting this today. I would also like to extend a special welcome to those of you who are unable to be here, but they are following us online, sydsvenskan.se live, but also watching us later at Kunskapskanalen or perhaps on YouTube. You're also very welcome. So what are we up to here for the next hour or so? Well, I am going to walk you through it a little bit, but don't expect a stereotypical debate. It's not going to be you're against this and I'm for that. That's not exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to try to just have a bit of an academic talk show for ourselves and talk about these things that we are all so interested in and so passionate about. And we have, as I mentioned, a stellar lineup to help us do that. I'd like to introduce them to you now. And starting closest to me here is Marina Svensson from the University of Lund. She's a professor of modern China studies. So warm hand for Marina Svensson. Honorary Doctor at Lund, Lawrence Lessig. I do realize that he is also a professor of law at Harvard and stuff, but here he is honorary doctor more than anything. We like to claim him. Moving on, Amelia Andersdotter. We're proud to have an alumna of this university here. She's a former member of the European Parliament for the Pirate Party and today a very well-renowned activist for internet issues. Amelia Andersdotter, welcome. Last but not least, former Prime Minister and Secretary of State of Sweden, Mr. Carl Bildt. Warmly welcome. So I do hope that you also love impossible questions, because we certainly have one. Will digital destroy democracy, or will it not? We're of course not going to try to find a yes or no answer to that, but we're going to try to pull it in a few different directions, in a few different ways to see if we can get anywhere with this. Now, I'm going to start here. A lot of data supports the claim that the world is getting better. The world is becoming a better place. Still, political conflicts seem to harden. So does the digital revolution play a part in this perceptual distortion? And anybody can start.
I would argue it's not a perceptual distortion. The world is long-term getting a better place, and that has to do with the development of science and technology. And we getting closer to each other in X numbers of respects. But at the same time, for separate reasons, it is getting into a somewhat more messy period. And I sometimes argue that we've been spoiled, those of us sitting here. We've been fortunate to live through a period, or two periods, I would say, that have been, in their own particular ways, extremely fortunate, if you look at it in a longer historical perspective. I think the last quarter of a century is probably the best quarter of a century for mankind ever. I'm not saying that the next quarter of a century is going to be the worst for mankind ever. I hope not. But I think it's going to be slightly more messy. I think we are back to normal. That's a popular phrase these days in terms of global developments. So less only harmonious, positive developments, more clouds on the horizons, but still, yes, we have the possibility of continuing to build an even better world.
And so the biggest invention we've had over the past 25 years, I would argue, is the everyman's access to the internet. So do we connect these two things, right or wrong?
We do to a certain extent, but it's not only that. I mean, it's a lot of other things. I mean, I would argue to be politically not particularly sort of conventional wisdom today tends to be a different one, but I would say that what we've seen is since 1945, but prior to that we had the Industrial Revolution and science and technology. Since 1945, the building of what we call a liberal global order, and particularly since the last quarter of a century, the broadening and the deepening of that liberal global order. There are problems associated with everything, but I think that has brought prosperity to increasing numbers of people around the world. It has made it possible through spreading of science and technology and information to get rid of diseases and all sorts of things, even if we look at things that are close to me, war and peace. The number of people who are dying on battlefields are lower today than they have been in recorded history. Then we are better informed. So we know what's happening in Aleppo. Did previous generation know even where Aleppo was? I doubt. So perspectives are different, but if you look at the objective facts, yes, I confess to be among the optimists.
Oh, good, because Lawrence Lessig, in his brilliant presentation this morning, said that he wasn't overselling hope. And I think whoever listened to him this morning may agree. Have you become very pessimistic recently, Lawrence? Or can you just elaborate a little bit on why hope is not your number one thing at this point?
Well, I mean, I feel like most of the time that I've been writing and thinking about the internet, I've been selling its extraordinary upside. And I do think that some of the best things that have happened in the past 20 years have been tied in some way to the internet. But I increasingly think some of the worst things that have happened are also tied, importantly, to the internet. You have a very optimistic, happy picture of the world. I come from America. And it's hard to be happy and optimistic in the context of America right now. We have a failed institution of governance, and it's hard not to understand the rise of a phenomenon like Donald Trump as in some way tied to the loosening and transformations that have been affected by the internet. Now, I wouldn't shut off the internet because of Donald Trump, but I do think we have to understand the good and the bad that run together here.
Mm-hmm. Amelia, I'm curious to hear from you as well when it comes to this, because we live in a time now, it seems, where people are distrusting of the big institutions. People are disappointed in the big institutions. But I heard you say before when we were talking that there's really no point, or there's no really validity in the statement that the European Parliament, for example, is not looking out for us. Now, you've seen the European Parliament from the inside for a long time, and you've been working in Brussels with other things. What is your feel of the state of the democracy, of the state of the union there when it comes to these issues? Are we in a healthy place or are we not?
Well, so the internet and the World Wide Web, I think, does not necessarily solve the fundamental predicament of being human, which is how do we coexist in large numbers while still getting along and not butchering each other? The internet and the World Wide Web can be tools for us to explore ways of doing this, but they won't fundamentally solve the problem that it's difficult. The European Union is one form of institution where nation states can gather and talk endlessly about how to get over their problems. But the difficulty in building trust for such a big institution, which I would argue is somehow also unrelated to the internet or web digital issue that we're trying to address, is it's difficult for a private person or citizen in Sweden to relate to why a decision in Brussels could work out a particular way because of voter preferences in, say, Germany or Italy. So the European machinery somehow ends up complex in a way that it makes decisions based on the preferences of other groups of people with whom we've previously not had that much interaction inside of Europe. The internet and the World Wide Web, I believe, could be a mechanism by which we could learn how to relate to these other groups. But I also recognize that we're not really there yet. We're not using the internet or the World Wide Web as a kind of pan-European platform for learning how to relate to each other.
So I've sometimes argued that the internet is society and society is internet. There's no point in holding these two terms apart anymore, because that's what it was like in the beginning. We would say on society we do this, but on the internet we do this. Are we at a point now where that is a pointless divide?
Well, so there's been different theories about what the internet or the World Wide Web means for populations over the years, right? So there was this big discussion about whether the internet will displace geographical identities with biographical identities. That was about 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And that's partially true, that we have more biographical communities in the world now. So people that like Star Trek that get together and, you know, from all over Europe, and they go to a trip to South Korea or whatever. But for a large part, the policy discussions or governance of society, I guess, is still, in Europe at least, still locked very much to a nation state level.
Mm. And now you said this is Europe, and this so far we're talking about the Western world, or the at least somewhat democratized world. Now, Marina, your expertise is in China. It's a whole different set of rules from the beginning. For most of us, we're widely ignorant on what's going on in Chinese policy and in Chinese everyday life, unfortunately. What's the state of the union for the internet as far as a tool for democracy right now in the world's largest country?
Well, I think first of all, one should remember we talk about Sweden and the US, which is highly connected, whereas the population in the world in general, I think it's less than 50% who actually are connected. China is slightly better, it's 53% right now that are connected to the internet. So it's still a very small proportion of the Chinese population. And it's also, when we talk about this digital destroying democracy, well, in China you don't have democracy to start with. So the question is, do the digital or internet help democratize China? I think that is something that people believed some years ago, but not anymore. Actually, what we see in China right now is that the Communist Party is actually using digital technologies to strengthen its power and its control over the society. So digital activism is actually going down in China if you compare it to 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm. So the problem is that we're thinking of it as too much, maybe in idealistic terms, when it's in fact just a motor for hanging out and shopping, socializing.
Well, it's many things, both in the West and in China. I mean, Chinese people are no different from people in Sweden or the US. What people do mostly on the internet is shopping or chatting with friends or connecting, looking at funny videos, etc. But of course, there are also people in China, human rights lawyers and others, who are using the internet or trying to use the internet to connect and to discuss political issues. But they are a very small minority, and they are extremely surveilled and actually targeted under President Xi Jinping.
Carl?
No, just to reinforce that particular point, and China is an interesting example to discuss, because the Chinese regime has gone to absolutely extraordinary length to control the internet, to control the access to information, to control that people are not spreading what they call rumors on the internet, which means information, and sometimes to block entire provinces of China when it comes to accessing the internet, although the economic cost of doing that is fairly big. You can interpret this in 2 different ways. You can interpret it in the ways that, well, China makes it possible for an authoritarian regime to control. But you can also interpret it in the way that I do. The authoritarian regimes are dead scared of the power of this. And they invest literally enormous resources in trying to control something that at the end of the day, I would say the battle is out, but at the end of the day, they will have difficulties containing. Because there are ways in which, you can say it's a minority, distinct minority in Big China, they can access things anyhow. And young people are incredibly inventive in going around even the most sophisticated control mechanism. That applies to China more than other places perhaps, but it applies to any other place as well, I would guess.
But isn't it true too, though, what you said, that the government will go to great lengths to control this and use it to keep? Isn't that true about the United States as well? I mean, what's really different?
Well, it's certainly true that the United States has developed and deployed an extraordinary surveillance infrastructure,
Yeah.
and I guess I share the sense of hope that these hacker kids will find ways around the infrastructure of the internet, but the infrastructure of the internet is not a given. evolves, and it is evolved by entities trying to control it. And especially in China, they've done a very sophisticated job in rebuilding the basic pipes so that
Now we're talking hardware, servers,
everything.
everything.
And so, one has to be very brave or stupid in that context to be exploring ways to get around the government. And in the United States, I know people who are involved in work that they need to keep it confidential from the government. There's a general fear that there's no obvious way to do that. There's technologies that purport to have to build in security, but there's a general sense that the basic infrastructure of security has been weakened intentionally by the United States government in response to the fears around terrorism.
And then we come back to of course, you mentioned the word hope again. What can we do? Or let's phrase it like this. Who owns the internet? Who should we go to change and complain and make better?
So the European Union is in a happy position because we have had a good and strong competitive telecommunications market for a good many years since the 1990s. Liberalization worked well. In the United States, the infrastructure, so the actual cables that run in the ground or the telephone poles or what have you, are much more concentrated in their ownership. So I think in the European Union, we have a better chance of turning to somebody or some provider that does not engage. As consumers, we can express preferences in a way that we wouldn't have been able to if we'd been living in the United States or in China. I'm also generally hopeful about the European Union as a platform for cooperation between nation states, because the European Union is a significant economic force in the world that does not in itself have intelligence capabilities or even really ambitions or defense ambitions. So there's no deep state in the European Union, which allows the European Union to be a more naive policy place, if you will, where you can have idealistic ambitions, such as let's do what's good for citizens, let's do security in a way that's good for consumers, let's bear in mind what the little guy needs and wants from market providers rather than what the government can procure to ensure that unruly elements don't behave in a bad way.
That's so cute.
I know. So the European Union is a great and naive. But it's like
amazing.
I say, it's like kind of
it's
this
a great
naive
distinction.
vision of what the European Union could be. And it's not granted that the European Union will be up to the task that I envisage it to have. But I recognize this as an institutional opportunity of the European Union that I believe would be sore to find in other places around the world, like Russia or China or the US, because there would always be these cynical institutions in the background that somehow come from a different age with less idealism.
So you mentioned three entities. You mentioned the telecom market, the private companies, you mentioned the union, and you mentioned the nation state. So there's three different powers, or three different players that can affect this, and that's good for us.
Well, there's, of course, also citizens. I mean, you have citizens acting as consumers with respect to the telcos, and you can also have citizens acting in their capacity as citizens with respect to legislators and institutions. So I think the citizen is not an actor to be forgotten in this.
But on top of the hardware layer, there's a software or computer or company layer. And I think one of the dramatic changes of the internet over the past 15 years is that we've gone from an internet to the world of Facebook or the world of Apple or the world of Google. And there's a very interesting dance that develops with those companies and governments, or at least deep state governments, not necessarily the EU, where initially after 9/11 in the United States, there was substantial cooperation to facilitate surveillance in that context. And then, very interestingly, there came a point where these companies no longer wanted to play ball. And so there was a number of high-profile cases of companies like Apple standing up to the US government saying they were not going to cooperate, and people begin adopting infrastructure, HTTPS infrastructures to secure all web traffic to make it impossible to be surveilling. And there's this open war now with the government and these companies about whether they're going to facilitate this surveillance, which I think is a hopeful development. I mean, it's not what I predicted, so I'm happy to be wrong about this, but I think it's an opportunity to open up this debate.
I love the fact that all three of you are doing this right now. So just run with the ball, Carl, and we move it on.
Well, I mean, the basic question that you asked, who owns the internet? No one does. Internet is a technology. Who owns the printing technology? Who knows? Everyone can use it. Another question is who governs the internet? The governance of the internet is a rather complicated system, which we call the multi-stakeholder model. What is the multi-stakeholder model? You can define it in different ways. The way I'd like to describe it and like it to work, it is a system that can't be captured by anyone. It can't be captured by big business. It can't be captured by big interest groups. It can't be captured by big states. And you could argue, discuss which is the biggest of these threats. I would say, going back to China, the big state threat is an obvious one. The big business one is another one. Big interest one could be the tech community, which is another stakeholder. All of them are part of a rather elaborate system of doing the sort of the numbers and the algorithms and the standards of this particular system. And the fact that this has worked, I mean, we were looking back at, say, 30 years or something like that, when the internet has gone from being nothing, something for techies and nerds and a couple of others, to being the by far most important infrastructure of the global economy. And now on the verge of becoming, very shortly, the infrastructure of every other infrastructure of the world. It has worked amazingly well and is not being captured by any one of these interests.
Yeah, but
and to preserve that system is, I think, one of the extremely important points for the future.
You're correct about the address space or
Yep.
the basic protocols that
Yeah.
enable.
Yep.
But the actual place that control gets exerted is on top of all of that. And that is actually controlled because it's within commercial domains. So it is, your life as a developer inside of Facebook is a function of Facebook's judgment. Your life as a developer.
True. I mean, Facebook is controlled by Facebook. Twitter is controlled by Twitter. States do control as well, as we discussed. And following the terrorist attack in Sweden, whatever that was, 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, we have a new debate about encryption and things like that. So there are all of these different elements of it. But if you don't like Facebook, you can go to the Chinese system, or you can go to the Korean system, or if you don't like the WhatsApp, you can go to Telegraph, you can go to Signal, or whatever, if you want to. But
that's the problem, though. People don't want to, right?
Or can't.
Or can't.
Well, they can if they want, but sometimes they don't want.
No, but I mean, is it? They can theoretically. My mother is a 69-year-old retired teacher who's added 350 some friends on Facebook. It's not broken enough for her to go through that again in some other social network. She's never going to do that. So she does have the free choice, but in reality, she's not going to make that choice out of comfort.
I mean, you have also now the added complexity of public institutions increasingly being present on Twitter and on Facebook, which means that the only viable way of getting in touch with your local police officer might be to go on Facebook and participate in the Facebook community. So while a lot of public authorities in Sweden are doing the social media thing because it's hip, it also effectively locks citizens down to that platform because it becomes the only way to meaningfully interact with your public authorities.
And why don't we debate that more, you think?
Because it's cool to be on social media, and it's also driven by the government, right? It's like
And
an
because
entire
Facebook-
industry around this.
And Facebook censors it all, so you don't actually.
Of course,
see
we
it.
can.
We aren't. I mean, we did. Going back to what happened in Stockholm, then 10 days or 2 weeks ago, I forgot exactly when. That was an interesting experiment, also in the sort of social media and the importance of that, because the police authorities were able to get a picture out very fast, and they got it out really fast in the sense that everyone got it through social media. But what was social media? I mean, we have research on this at the moment. It was the traditional media. It wasn't the Facebook things. It was, as a matter of fact, commercial break, Aftonbladet, Expressen, and Sveriges Radio. Those were the ones that, through the social media, reached out to people. And of course, those are highly competitive. They compete with each other. So it wasn't, which is often the popular perception, that we are sort of locked into the Facebooks. Yes, we are, I guess. Not me, but others are. On different...
No, you're locked into Twitter.
I'm Twitter. Another commercial break. So it is a much more diversified space than I think it is getting credit for. And sometimes extremely important, as was showed in this particular case.
Well, if you think about the democracy issue, which is I think, relevant to our debate tonight, right? You know, in the United States context, in this last election, a huge proportion, especially of younger people, would be getting their, quote, news, not from these traditional sources, but as things shared by their friends on Facebook. And that dynamic is different. I mean, the most important difference from my perspective is when they got it from traditional news, there was somebody called an editor in the middle. Now, you could think the editor was a biased editor or whatever, and no doubt some are. But the one thing the editor did was check the veracity of the claims. So if somebody was making a claim that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring in the basement of a pizza parlor, in the old days...
True fake story, just if you haven't heard it. This is a fake story that was really out there.
This was a story that Alex Jones, one of the most prominent right-wing crazies on radio, was promoting, that this is in fact what she was doing in Washington, D.C., and a guy was driven to take a gun and to go down there to hunt out the pedophiles, to sort of out them. This story becomes part of the political debate because there is no editor in the middle of this story, and that dynamic is different. I mean, I think we got to start by just recognizing there is this change, and maybe it's not a problem unless you see what in fact happened in the election. But I think it's a significant change.
Marina, you had your hand up.
Well, it was actually a little bit earlier on the discussion about the companies. In China, of course, there is this collaboration between internet companies and the state, where actually the internet companies are doing the censorship. And also benefiting from Facebook and Twitter being blocked from China. So it's actually possible to develop very good platforms. And WeChat, for instance, probably none of you use it. It's 500 million people using it. So it's an immense platform for Chinese citizens, but it is censored in very devious ways that you are not even know when you are being censored. So that's also the problematic of censorship in the context of China these days.
So I can go back to the ownership of infrastructure. It's actually last year I was fortunate to spend 3 months in India researching cybersecurity and consumer issues with an incredible center based in Bangalore called the Center for Internet and Society that have also done a lot of research on the multi-stakeholder model. And so I think the problem a bit with the governance of the internet or the ownership of the internet, both as a technical infrastructure and as a political issue, is it's effectively American. We can say that the American government doesn't have a public authority like the NTIA or the FCC that does the governance, but the fact of the matter is it's an American company that sponsors ICANN by more than 1/5 of their total resources. Most of the companies that participate in the Internet Engineering Task Force, even if the people are there as kind of autonomous engineers, at the end they're on the payroll of an American company. There were issues with the Internet Research Task Force crypto group where they'd had high-level NSA officials working with the cryptographic implementations, which brought, especially after the Snowden revelations, the suspicion that they may have kept usable cryptography back from the general public because it was not perceived to be in the intelligence community's interest. And so as we've had some of these very traumatic, especially intelligence and security, internet security-related revelations in the past few years, it's become a problem that the United States or companies in the United States over which the United States can exert military authority or police authority are so dominant economically in these processes because it simply decreases the legitimacy of the entire structure. The United States has somehow internationally displayed that, hey, we're not actually dependable. We said we'd keep a hands-off approach, but in fact, we haven't kept a hands-off approach. And so now there are some other states, like in France, they've rapidly speeded up the investment in their own kind of government-controlled infrastructures. Germany is doing the same. Even Sweden is doing this. So there is this problem of ownership and international governance of what do we do with this global infrastructure, where it somehow, I think, feels to a lot of states, and India is definitely one of them, that they're not, in fact, in control. And just saying that there's a platform, an ICANN forum organized once every 6 months to which you can travel and mingle over cocktails with important people from the ICANN board is not enough to re-legitimize this process of governance.
No, you might argue that, but it's still the functioning system. And the alternative, which is favored by notably the Chinese government, is to hand it over to the governments of the world. And most of the governments of the world don't really care about things like human rights and things like that. And most of the governments of the world have one particular interest in the internet, and that is controlling it. So the alternative to the present multi-stakeholder approach, you could criticize in different ways, is to hand it over to governments, and I think that would be worse. And I would also argue that the system actually works amazingly well so far. I thought about that. The one you should have invited to the panel, not instead of us, needless to say, but in addition to us, is one of the true giant of internet governance, Patrik Fällström. He lives.
Yeah, he lives close.
He lives close
we should
to
get
here.
him if we can get him out.
He is a sort of a Skåne superpower in the entire internet governance world, and knows every single bloody detail that we don't know. And he's part of that sort of system of informal multi-stakeholder governance where Swedes have become rather important. That actually works. I think he's been a consultant to Cisco, as a matter of fact, for a while, which doesn't make him less Patrik Fällström and a Skåne person, but anyhow. So I would argue that this multi-stakeholder system that we have has served us extremely well. The alternative is handing it over to governments. I'm in favor of governments now and then, but I'm not has to be, but I'm not in favor of handing every power over everything over to governments, because then I think I will be accused of being paid by the Chinese government, and
so
I'm not.
I feel as if you're purposefully misinterpreting or missing the point of what I said, which is that the basic feeling of the governance model as it works today is that it's not governments that control it, but a government, a particular government, which has a disproportionate amount of influence over the companies and the institutions that decide what is the globally beneficial thing for this infrastructure to be and to do. And so that is essentially the problem. And yes, we can say the alternatives that are on the table at this moment, they're not better, but I think this lack of legitimacy is still quite a big problem that more people could take seriously and not just brush off as, yeah, but the International Telecommunications Union is bad. It's a real issue. It's a real issue in India, and it's a real issue in China. And just because China is China doesn't mean that they're less legitimate of an actor in expressing concerns on the geopolitical field, let's say.
No, and I would agree with you, particularly concerning India, because that's a different story. And you do have a point, of course. I mean, the internet wasn't invented by Al Gore, really, but it was invented in the United States. And the United States is a dominant force, and ICANN is located in California. But what was done last year, and I was involved in that particular process, was to do the last handover of the last formal authorities that the US government had, the so-called IANA authority, over the basic system. That was handed over to a rather elaborate structure. So now the US government, which had a basic, what could say, backup emergency function with the root server system, that the US government has backed away from. We were extremely fortunate to be able to get that through US Congress during the last few weeks of the Obama administration. Would not have worked under this present system. And now it is truly more multi-stakeholder in order to get sort of other governments, and the government of India, to take your example, has been extremely important in this particular aspect. Because, I mean, Chinese, one issue, India, messy democracy, but as a matter of fact, a democracy, and bound to be the greatest internet nation of the world within 2 decades or something like that.
So it feels like you're again avoiding or missing the point, which is, okay, so the United States now has no public authorities that are directly responsible for any internet governance. But if you look at the way American cloud service providers are now positioning themselves in the European Union to sell their services to, say, public authorities or companies here, it's a de facto issue that American authorities, police authorities, law enforcement, and the rest claim authority over any company that is based in the United States. Or even just 3 or 4 months ago, the FBI decided that they can lawfully hack any computer in the entire world. what kind of a expression of international solidarity or responsibility is that? That's effectively saying that you're going to exercise power in other countries, you're not going to care about anyone else. And I come back, there's a lack of legitimacy there. The United States is not signaling that it's a responsible herald of what at the same time it says is a common infrastructure that could potentially be democratically useful or potentially not. But there is this ownership issue there, I think, where it looks effectively as if there's all pigs are equal, but some are more equal than most.
Yeah, I mean, but another way to get at this point is that the part, Carl, that you're talking about that has this international governance structure that doesn't depend on governments is a tiny slice of the relevant and important issues of governing in the internet. I mean, it governs the address space so that when I put in an IP address, it associates with some particular computer. That's well governed, and it's not the United States Congress that cares much about that. But when it's security policies, or when it's a decision about whether you're going to cooperate with terrorist policies, or you're going to cooperate to help surveil citizens, that's not ICANN's problem. That's not the stuff ICANN deals with. And with respect to that, it really is a question of these companies that own the dominant power, that have the dominant power, that then have to interact with governance. And I completely agree, they interact primarily and they depend primarily on keeping the United States government happy. And the United States government has not shown itself committed to principles that they want to see universalized across all free nations, let alone China.
Well, I mean, the same problem we have in Europe. When it comes to the state has said, I'm not in favor of handing all powers to the states, but I'm in favor of a functioning state. The state have a responsibility for upholding law and order, at least law, in a society. And that we must do in different sorts of ways. That includes upholding laws on the net. That applies also using sometimes surveillance powers on the net in order to fight criminality, terrorism and other things. That has to be regulated by laws that are as explicit and as transparent as possible. We did have something in the European Union, which was called the directive for the data retention directive, which regulated this. You could discuss whether that was sufficient or not. You would probably say not sufficient, but anyhow,
I think the European Court of Justice agreed with me on the 21st
of
December last year. So
they did. So they threw it out. I think it was somewhat earlier than that. But anyhow, they threw it out. That left for every other government to do it in its own way. And the Swedish government at the time decided to do something completely much more intrusive than has been there under the European regulation. And that is a problem. Most people are not aware of this. We talk about sort of internet. I would say that in terms of intrusions of privacy, metadata, which we get our mobile telephones, that is far more intrusive in terms of privacy than most people are aware of. And here we lack a sufficiently strong both European and national legislation to protect our privacy at the same time as we have sort of a state interest. If we take the guy, and I have no other information that is available in the public domain in this particular case, but I'm quite certain when they got this guy from Stockholm, the first thing they did was to get his mobile telephone. And then you do digital forensics on that, and then you do the metadata, and everything follows from that. I'm okay with that to a certain extent. But I don't want every single police authority or every single public authority in the country to have the possibility of doing that. And this is national and European legislation that we must get. That has very little to do with the internet, but it has a lot to do with privacy and with integrity and the basic distinction, I would argue, between free societies and not free societies, and between societies where we have the rule of the law and where we have the rule with the law or by the law. It
makes a whole lot of sense, but that's also the way you can argue that you can have a super surveillance state. That's the way it's going to sound when somebody makes that case. So how do we as citizens protect ourselves from that? How do we distinguish between a legitimate concern, a legitimate need for safety, security, and personal privacy, common decency, the need for every man to have his own space? How do we distinguish that?
I mean, that's not a a relevant trade-off at all. You don't weigh privacy against security. You can have both. There's no contradiction in terms between these. Now, what I think where privacy legislation or data protection legislation, as the European Union is now becoming very known for, makes a big difference in how it regulates economic incentives on the private sector to develop their technologies. So there's a lot of very successful firewall companies that are selling their products to China, and they're developing them, every day, making more and more fantastic ways of filtering internet content, because there's a market for that, and there's a market that pays well. Now, what the European Union has tried to do with the data protection regulation is ensure that there will be a market for an opposite type of development as well, that there will be a market for privacy-preserving products. Politicians have in this way an enormous amount of power, not only over things like what the police does or what the intelligence services do, or how social services are regulated, but also in that they make the economic framework or the rules in which economic actors have to become successful. We can say maybe politicians cannot always predict what kind of technologies will be successful in the end, but politicians can definitely make sure that those things that they don't want to be economically successful will not be. And this is where, when I listened to Lawrence Lessig this morning, I kind of did not agree with some of the stuff that you said, because for me it's very obvious that the government can still fine companies until companies do what is preferable for the government. So the government is in this way still sovereign and supreme, that whoever has the money to drain somebody else of money, and the government is always fundamentally at last that entity is also going to be the most powerful entity at the end of the day.
So this is, once again, this very cute idea of a government that's independent of the economic interests of a society, which maybe that's a European view, but in America it's a hard view to sustain. So when you,
we just fined Ireland 13 billion euros for not collecting taxes from Apple.
Yes, it's quite extraordinary. So, but what's striking about this whole conversation is we still haven't gotten what feels to me to the part of the story that is the most significant in affecting behavior that the government doesn't have anything to do with. So again, think about the way in a democracy information flows in the context of Facebook or things like that. The economic incentives that Facebook creates for producing all sorts of fake news inside of that platform. And the way in which that affects the ultimate outcome of an election, even when played by foreign governments like the Russian government, that the United States government itself, and even ICANN, has nothing to do with, right? So this is an incredibly important part of the question of what the role of the internet is in the democracy that we've got to have a way to talk about. And I know that it's something you're very concerned with, to talk about and understand the role of private power in defining these public values, but I think that's one of the fundamental questions that we don't yet have a good way to think about answering here.
But then can I pose a question to you, which is about United States spectrum policy, and in particular radio talk show hosts, conservative radio talk show hosts. As far as I understand, they've been active for quite a while. I mean, they're not a recent phenomenon, not as recent as the internet, or I could be wrong. And they say things on air like Rush Limbaugh or Alex Jones, these type of people, that to me as a Swedish citizen or maybe as a European are just completely alien. How can you possibly go on air and say that? And that's a consequence, I think, of the United States spectrum policy essentially opening up for that type of communications. Couldn't it just be then that when you leave a space open for anyone to produce their own content, you will have some of these expressions that some of us find alien to the public debate. But then in the US, you've actually already been plagued by for a good many, I say plagued, I mean in the broad sense plagued, for a good many years.
Well, it's certainly true that in the context of talk radio, conservative talk radio developed around really AM radio stations. It wasn't about the opening up of spectrum in any interesting way. It was really just the old traditional spectrum playing to a very specific kind of audience. And I think the government had some role perhaps in enabling, and it didn't try to regulate, and it couldn't regulate because of the nature of the First Amendment. But that dynamic, I think, is still distinct from the kind of dynamic we've seen develop in the context of a world where people shift their consumption of news from news organizations, and I wouldn't call talk radio news organizations, to private produced news, which is stuff that gets shared on Facebook. That's a different dynamic, and I think that's a question. I don't know how to answer it, but I think that's the question.
You were onto that this morning, though, in a very interesting way. At least this thought was completely new to me. You mentioned that, of course, we want a broad spectrum of culture. Of course, we want all these sorts of expressions. That's wonderful. We'll have this, we'll have that. That's great. But that can also in itself be a problem for democracy. That richness of culture can be a problem for democracy. Can you tell the audience just a little bit about that reasoning?
Well, the richness of culture is wonderful to the extent that it's encouraging lots of different creativity, and creativity, I think, needs lots of encouragement and support. That's fine. But democracy depends on there being a common conversation to address the common problems of the democracy. And if you've got no context or opportunity for a significant portion of the society to have that common conversation, if they don't even know the facts, if they don't have a common sense of the facts, it disables the capacity to make these kinds of judgments. And this is, one of the most dramatic developments of the bifurcation of the news sources. If there are facts that are not mentioned on Fox News, conservatives don't know about them. They just don't, because this becomes their bubble of content. And the same thing for some facts on the liberal side. And this dynamic is the same thing that we celebrate on the culture side when we say diversity. I mean, I don't care if people who listen to opera never have anything to do with rap music. That doesn't bother me at all. That's their choice. But it does bother me if people who think they know something about foreign policy have no basis from any facts that have been presented about what's actually going on in foreign policy. This is the conflict that's produced by a platform that's primarily an entertainment platform being co-opted to be used as a democracy platform. And it's a conflict that's manifested itself now that's become so good as an entertainment platform.
That honestly sounds almost impossible to combine, though. How do we keep a pluralistic culture and a developing democracy where there actually are some figurative common spaces, town squares, bonfires, where we can agree on a few things around the universities, around the big media, or whatever? How do you have any hope in that one, or is that asking?
No, that was the part I was not hopeful about. Remember?
I know, I remember that.
Yeah.
That's why we want to try to. Yeah. You get a second chance. Maybe Carl wants to be the hope entrepreneur.
That was his job.
I'm hopeful. I've been in politics for a long time. I've always been irritated by people who have completely different points of view than I have. But it's been a fact. I've been sort of learned to live with that, and sometimes I have sort of based that on completely different versions of the way in which the world works. That's not news. That's been the case for a long time.
No, but it's digital. It can spread a gazillion times.
It can spread more, faster, but not very much more faster, as a matter of fact. I mean, I'm 500 years ago, I'm now busy reading through the Reformation, 1517. And that was really the first thing where the printing press had an impact. It is amazing when you read it, how sort of something, a sermon delivered by Martin Luther in Wittenberg, could spread within a week or 10 days through everyone who was anything in Germany at the time. I mean, Germany was a smaller place, not in geographic terms, but in terms of population, of course. Amazing, wildfire that literally put Germany on fire with the printing press. So, acknowledge the digital age is a different one, but I would argue, contrary to, say, 25 years ago when I went to discussion at Akademiska föreningen or some other odd place around Sweden, people are far better informed now than they were at that particular time. Far better informed. They know more about the other point of view than they used to do. They know more about the facts. They know more about the fake news as well. And they have a more lively interest in actually finding out. So the spread of information, I would say, has been there. More diversified, absolutely. But I think overall, and lots of loony people are around. That was always the case, by the way. Lund, no exception. But I would say overall, it is a far more both diversified and informed public opinion that we have today than we had before the internet.
But
Okay,
the
so
word
that's
we,
helpful.
the word we is really important because
Yeah,
you're
we.
talking about Europe. And the whole premise of the conversation I was having is that the
No, I would
technical architecture
I would even
of-
talk about India.
Okay, talk about India too, that's fine. But what I'm saying is, when I'm describing the problem, I'm describing a particular technical architecture that's developed in the context of the United States.
I would even talk about the United States.
Well, then we would disagree because the diversity and the way this concentration has developed and the polarization in the context of this media has had a measurable effect. I mean, I'm not asserting it without basis in what people have studied about this. There has been a difference that's evolved because of this technology, and that's the thing that drives to the question of what do we do when this continues and has even a greater effect because of this separation.
So let's go.
I should disagree too much with you, but you are a professor. I'm a failed student at Stockholm University. But one of the things I am, I'm sort of associated with the Washington Post right now and then. So I was there 10 days ago. I went through their sort of digital thing that they're doing at the moment. What is that? Washington Post was a loss-making newspaper, failed newspaper, papers and things like that. It was taken over by Jeff Bezos, Amazon. Why did he take it over? I don't know. But he brought sort of digital technologies to this particular newspaper. What is happening today? It is booming. Not the paper version that much, but the digital version, booming all over the world. They are signing up, I mean, he said to me, tens of thousands of new subscriptions every day around the world. I don't believe that. But say they're signing up thousands of subscriptions every day digitally all over the world. And they are hiring people like hell, because suddenly there's a requirement. This is a Trump effect, inverse Trump effect most probably. There's a demand for quality information suddenly, and they have found ways of reaching out well beyond what you could do with a paper newspaper, not only to an audience in Washington, D.C., small place, although fairly significant, US, and the world. This is fairly bad for the Swedish newsprint industry, paper and pulp industry, but I think it has made, it is a better world from the information point of view.
Okay, so
And
we
the
see,
same would apply to-
different perspectives there. But now I want to hear from Marina one question. You mentioned something really interesting. About half of the world's population is now online. About half. And most people who know anything about this will argue that within 10 years or so, we're going to be at 90%, and that's going to be rural Africa, South America, and it's going to be China. Now, all these people who are going to be new online within the next decade, how do you, and I realize this is truly an impossible question, how will they affect, and in a good way, hopefully, from democratic terms, how will they affect the internet that we're going to be talking about 10 years from now?
Well, we still have the problem that you are addressing with the big companies and Facebook. And you, in the context of China, you still have the issue, even if there are more people on using the internet, it's still within the Chinese intranet where the internet is controlled. So in that sense, maybe there will not be much change. But I do agree with that there's more, people are better informed, and you can use the digital technologies for all kinds of empowerment, like women's empowerment, for example, in many different countries. But I don't see any dramatic changes just because more people are on the internet. It depends on what kind of platforms, how open the platforms are, and what people actually are doing, and how the online and offline is aligned also. So the digital in itself will not promote democracy or more political participation. It's still the elite speaking on social media, I think.
Since we're approaching the full hour, I want to touch on something. When we 4 years ago had Lawrence Lessig here, he was busy preparing. We didn't know that then. Maybe you didn't either. Running for president in the United States, which he did as an act of protest, I would almost say, and got a lot of attention for the thoughts that he spoke about here. I remember one thing you said that stuck with me. You said that the corruption of American politics doesn't have to be the most important issue, but it has to be the first issue. So you have to fix that first before you can go on and argue about the other things that you want to fix through politics. I will ask you to translate that into a specific digital. What is not the most important question for our digital future, but which is the first? What do we need to get at now as these people leave the room?
Well, unfortunately, I'm stuck because I still think that to get the digital right, you've got to have the government right. the United States right now, we see a huge rollback in all of the progress the Obama administration made at the behest of exactly the same kind of corruption interests. So the United States Congress voted to allow ISPs to sell private data of their customers. Why? There's no principled argument for it. It was just there was a huge amount of money on the table that they collected from these ISPs because they wanted to be able to sell this, to monetize this information. At the same time that Donald Trump said lobbyists visiting the White House deserved privacy, so he would not release the names of the lobbyists visiting the White House signed a law that said that all of your internet data could be sold to the highest bidder. So the same thing with network neutrality. Network neutrality is about to be overthrown. And why is it going to be overthrown? It's not a principled argument. It's an argument that's tied directly to the same kind of
just since that is such an important issue, can you give us the 20-second university professor explanation of the concept net neutrality?
Well, no, I think you did it best. I mean, I think the point that you argued earlier, that Europe has had a wonderfully competitive infrastructure market because of policy decisions made by the governments in Europe. And the United States, though originally had sold this policy immediately in the Bush administration, we reversed ourselves. And what we've seen is concentration and terrible infrastructure built inside the United States. And after Obama tried to go back a little bit on that, now the Trump administration is going right back to this bad policy. So I'm just limited in my ability to think creatively in response to your question, because I still think this is the core issue to solve, not just in digital, but in every other issue. And what we saw in this last election is that people love to talk about corruption. Bernie Sanders loved to talk about corruption. Donald Trump loved to talk about corruption. But for the purpose of beating up Hillary Clinton, not for the purpose of trying to actually rally America to any particular solution that would take money out of politics. And certainly that wasn't Donald Trump's objective.
But now we're in the situation where a couple of rich guys really can go to the big telcos of the United States and say, how about you just prioritize all the traffic to Fox News for the next election and make it a little slower to CNN and New York Times, and we're paying you, and there's no stopping that.
Absolutely.
That's scary.
Yeah,
you don't even need power. You just need money to accomplish that.
Yeah, I mean, and of course, everybody's focused on the free speech dimension of network neutrality. In my view, the most important is the innovation dimension of network neutrality. I mean, would there have been Skype if the providers of broadband, who at the time Skype was born were basically in the United States telecom companies, were allowed to say, I'm sorry, you're not allowed to develop that application because we don't like it? Would there have been YouTube if cable companies were able to say, no, before you're allowed to deploy your product, you've got to come get permission from us? The cable companies would never have given permission for YouTube. So the basic principle of network neutrality is that the network owners are not in the business of being able to pick and choose content and applications. That's the choice of the consumers. But when we reverse that, yes, of course, the innovation space will be sold to the highest bidder, and that will be the dinosaurs of the age blocking this new type of innovation and new type of content.
Why are we not taking to the streets over this?
In Sweden, we don't have to because we already have good competition. We have 5 mobile network owners, which is the most of any European country. Every household can effectively choose between one, except the most unfortunate households, there are some. But most households in Sweden can choose between 1 or 2 or 3 different internet service providers. If your ISP or mobile operator treats you in a way you don't like, you can go somewhere else. This is why net neutrality has never really caught on as a public issue in Sweden the way it did in Germany or in Belgium. When I moved to Belgium in 2010, my landlord used to get upset with me because I watched the same YouTube video several times and we ran over our monthly traffic quota in 2010. And I was at that time moving from Lund, where I was on a 10 megabit symmetric connection, and I thought I'd ended up in the third world. I just literally could not understand the concepts of traffic quotas. So those European countries where the competition enforcement in the telecom sector didn't work well, they have now larger problems still with competition, of course. The same types as in the US with a few infrastructure providers, and they also have ancillary problems like net neutrality and ownership concentration in other medias as well, like media platforms or content platforms. Sweden is not in a terrible position because we had a market-oriented policy for internet infrastructures for a long time. But if one wanted to do something good for our country, it is presently the case that we have a shift from a market-oriented network policy in Sweden to a more defense-oriented internet policy in Sweden. So if one wanted to ensure that we can continue to have a society of prosperity and technologies, one would write to one's legislator and ask them not to support that policy shift.
Okay, that's something we can do as we exit the room.
That's a spectrum issue.
No, it's not a spectrum issue, it's a general issue. Write me an email and I'll give you the details. There's lots of policy issues where you can intervene usefully.
Lovely. I think
There's-
we'd love to get a bunch of those tips, because I think that's where we are right now, where we need to try to install some hope and move forward. I am going to have to cut you off because we're on the hour, and I know that you don't want to stop talking. I don't know that you don't want to stop listening, but let that energy go into these enormously important and interesting issues. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. Marina Svensson, Lawrence Lessig, Amelia Andersdotter, and Carl Bildt, and everybody who's in the room. Thank you and good night.